You may already know that when you eat carbohydrates, they get broken down into sugars. And the particular sugar we're referring to is glucose. When you eat a carbohydrate, your digestive system breaks it down to release glucose. Those tiny glucose molecules then pass into your blood so they can be carried off around the body. In this diagram, I've used green circles to represent molecules of glucose in the blood. However, it's important that your body controls the amount of glucose in the blood. If it gets too high, it can damage your cells. When your body detects that glucose levels are too high, it needs a system to lower them. This is where insulin comes in. In this video, we'll look at insulin and why it's important, and also diabetes when the process doesn't work. The video is broken into chapters, so feel free to jump ahead. The final chapter is a little bit more detailed and complicated for those who want more detail. So let's get started. If you're new here, welcome to BioSmash. I'm Jo, I'm a science teacher. I'll help you smash biology revision. In this first section, we'll look at what insulin is. You may already know that insulin is an example of a hormone. To understand how hormones work, it's helpful to think of what happens when you post a letter. For example, you could write your friend a letter containing a specific instruction. The letter gets picked up and transported around the city, and the letter is delivered at the target location. Hopefully, this means your friend can read the letter and act upon your instruction. In this example, the letter represents a hormone. A hormone is a chemical message sent by your body. The delivery truck represents the blood, which transports the message around the body. And your friend is the target, the place that the hormone message needs to reach. Let's look at this process in more detail. Hormones are produced by glands. We call them endocrine glands. Glands contain hormone-producing cells. These cells release the hormone, and the hormone passes into the blood, which transports the hormone to a target cell. Hopefully you now understand that insulin is a hormone produced by an endocrine gland that travels through the blood to target cells. Give this video a thumbs up if you're starting to understand this topic better. Now that we understand hormones, let's look at what happens when your blood glucose concentration gets too high. Your body works hard to keep your blood glucose concentration at a certain level. However, if you eat food that's high in carbohydrates, such as bread and cakes, this can cause your blood glucose level to increase to a concentration of blood glucose that's too high. This rise in blood glucose level is detected by insulin-producing cells. These cells release insulin. The cells that release insulin are actually found in the pancreas. The pancreas can be found near the stomach, and the pancreas is an example of an endocrine gland because it releases hormones. The specific cells in the pancreas that release insulin are called beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. The insulin passes into the blood and travels to target cells. And in the case of insulin, the target cells are liver and muscle cells. Blood flows past the liver and muscle cells. Insulin receptors can be found on the surface of the liver and muscle cells. If glucose levels are too high and insulin is released into the blood, the insulin binds to the receptors on the liver and muscle cells. Once the insulin hormone binds, this triggers the liver and muscle cells to absorb glucose molecules from the blood. And because glucose molecules move into the liver and muscle cells from the blood, the concentration of glucose in the blood falls back to the expected level. Glucose molecules contain lots of energy, which your body needs to grow and move and keep warm. This means that it's important that the glucose molecules are stored so that they can be used later when the body needs energy. When glucose enters the liver cells, a special chemical process happens. The glucose molecules are joined together to form a larger molecule called glycogen. So glucose is made of single sugar units. But these glucose molecules can be joined together to form a molecule called glycogen, which is very branched and really good for storage. Glycogen is a good way to store glucose because it's highly compact, so lots of it can fit in the cells, and it's also insoluble, which means that it doesn't cause osmosis to happen. If you're not sure what osmosis is, I haven't got time to explain it fully today, but check out this video, which I'll link to below. Hopefully you can now see that insulin is produced in response to high blood glucose levels, and the effect is that it brings the blood glucose back down to the resting level. A rise in blood glucose level has triggered a process that brings the blood glucose level back down. This process is called negative feedback. I really hope you're finding this video helpful. If you are, then please do click subscribe. It will help you to find my other videos. Now let's look at what your body does if your blood glucose level drops too low. You may already know that your body uses glucose for a process called respiration. If you want to know more about respiration, you can check out this video linked below. But the key thing to know is that glucose is broken down by your body to release energy. Your body carries out respiration even when you're asleep. So if you haven't eaten for a while, your blood glucose levels may start to drop because exercise needs energy. If you're doing exercise, you'll do more respiration, and so your blood glucose levels may drop more quickly. So exercising and fasting are two reasons why your blood glucose concentration may drop too low. It can be dangerous for your blood glucose concentration to be too low. Luckily, your body produces another hormone, glucagon, to correct this. Here's a tip to help you remember that glucagon is produced when glucose levels have fallen. Just remember that when the glucose has gone, the body releases glucagon. Glucagon producing cells release glucagon when your blood glucose levels are too low. If you want to know the specific cell that makes glucagon, it's the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans. Remember, it's the beta cells that produce insulin. Because glucagon is a hormone, it passes into the blood and it travels through the blood until it reaches the target cells. In this case, the target cells are the liver, because it's in the liver cells that all the extra glucose was stored. Let's look inside a liver cell. Remember, the liver cell stores glucose as glycogen, which is a very branched molecule. When glucose is needed, the liver cell can break that glycogen back down to release glucose molecules. So the liver cells also contain glucagon receptors, and when the pancreas releases glucagon into the blood, the glucagon will travel to the liver cells and bind to the receptors. This triggers the liver cells to break the stored glycogen down back into glucose, and that glucose can pass back into the blood so that the blood glucose level goes back to where it should be. So to summarise, if blood glucose level drops too low, the body produces glucagon, which brings the level back up again. And this is another example of negative feedback, because when a level has changed, it triggers a series of processes that reverse the change. Now that we understand how blood glucose concentration is controlled, let's look at diabetes, an example of when it doesn't work correctly. So, you've probably heard of the medical condition diabetes. In people with diabetes, their blood glucose concentration becomes much higher than it should be. There are actually two types of diabetes. We call them type 1 and type 2. So let's be logical and look at type 1 first. In type 1 diabetes, the insulin producing cells of the pancreas do not produce insulin. This means that even if blood glucose levels are high, no insulin is released into the blood, so the liver and muscle cells do not receive any messages. So when blood glucose levels are high in the blood, the liver and muscle cells do not absorb the extra glucose as they should do, so levels of glucose in the blood can rise to very dangerous levels. Because people with diabetes have trouble controlling their blood glucose levels, they need to regularly measure the concentration of glucose in their blood. If someone has type 1 diabetes, they need to inject themselves with insulin when their blood glucose levels are too high. The injected insulin then tells the liver and muscle cells to store the extra glucose as glycogen. People with type 1 diabetes are also advised to have a carefully controlled diet and not eat lots and lots of carbohydrates. This keeps their blood glucose levels lower. It's also recommended that they take regular exercise because exercise uses up glucose through respiration. Now let's look at type 2 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes do still produce insulin, and this insulin travels through the blood to the liver cells. However, the liver and muscle cells do not respond correctly to the insulin. This means that when the insulin arrives, it doesn't bind in the usual way, and no glucose molecules are stored. If someone has a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, it's recommended that they try to control their blood glucose levels through exercise and controlling their diet. People are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes as they get older. People are also more likely to have the condition if they are obese. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, I'd love to hear from you, particularly if you've got any ideas I could cover in future videos. In this final section of the video, let's look at why it's important to control blood glucose levels. Here's a diagram of a sample of blood. The red blood cells are red, as you probably expect, and the glucose molecules are shown in green. The person has just eaten some sweets, so their blood glucose concentration has increased. Let's look at how this affects a nearby cell. The cytoplasm of the cell also contains a solution made of sugars, waters, and other substances. However, because the blood glucose concentration has got so high, this means the concentration of the liquid inside the cell is now lower than the concentration outside the cell. Both the cell and the blood contain water molecules, but because there's relatively more water molecules inside the cell, they diffuse out into the blood. You might recognise this process as osmosis. If you're not sure what osmosis is, I haven't got time to explain it fully today, but check out this video, which I'll link to below. Because the cell has lost water, it shrinks, and this affects how well it can work. This is one reason why it's important that our blood glucose concentration stays stable so that it doesn't negatively affect our cells. Our bodies also start to struggle if our blood glucose concentration gets too low. As we've already mentioned, all of our cells need glucose so that they can carry out respiration, and the cells need respiration to release energy for their processes. Our brain is one example of an organ and needs lots of glucose to receive lots of energy. Consequently, if the concentration of glucose in our blood drops, this can lead to us developing symptoms such as confusion, irritability, or even trembling. And if blood glucose levels drop to dangerous levels, this can cause symptoms such as loss of consciousness or seizures. If you made it this far, hopefully you now have a much better understanding of all of the things on this list. Really hope you found this video helpful. If you want to learn more about osmosis or respiration, check out these videos. Otherwise, YouTube is suggesting that this one might be good next.